So Facebook has announced a policy change that I want to share with everybody. Facebook allows war posts urging violence against Russian invaders. Okay, let's see what they say. Meta platforms will allow Facebook and Instagram users in some countries to call for violence against Russians and Russian soldiers in the context of the Ukraine invasion, according to internal emails seen by Reuters on Thursday. In a temporary change to its hate speech policy, the social media company is also temporarily allowing some posts that call for death to Russian President Vladimir Putin or Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko, according to internal emails to its content moderators. Quote, as a result of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we have temporarily made allowances for forms of political expression that would normally violate our rules, like violent speech such as death to the Russian invaders. We still won't allow credible calls of violence against Russian civilians, a Meta spokesperson said in a statement. The calls for the leaders' deaths will be allowed unless they contain other targets or have two indicators of credibility, such as the location or method, one email said in a recent change to the company's rules on violence and incitement. Citing the Reuters story, Russia's embassy in the United States demanded that Washington stop the extremist activities of Meta. Quote, users of Facebook and Instagram did not give the owners of these platforms the right to determine the criteria of truth and pit nations against each other, the embassy said on Twitter in a message that was also shared by their India office. The temporary policy changes on calls for violence to Russian soldiers apply to Armenia, Azerbaijan, Estonia, Georgia, Hungary, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Romania, Russia, Slovakia, and Ukraine, according to one email. In the email recently sent to moderators, Meta highlighted a change in its hate speech policy pertaining both to Russian soldiers and to Russians in the context of the invasion. Quote, we are issuing a spirit of the policy allowance to allow T1 violent speech that would otherwise be removed under the hate speech policy. A, targeting Russian soldiers except prisoners of war. B, targeting Russians where it's clear that the context is that the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Content mentions the invasion, self-defense, etc., it said in the email. Quote, we are doing this because we have observed that in this specific context, Russian soldiers is being used as a proxy for the Russian military. The hate speech policy continues to prohibit attacks on Russians, the email stated. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what's going on here. And by the way, they went on, as you can see there, they go on to say, Russia said it was banning Facebook in the country in response to what it said were restrictions of access to Russian media on the platform. So Facebook blocked like RT and Sputnik, and Russia says, okay, then we're going to block Facebook. We got the news the other day that Russia is also banning Instagram. They've banned all their independent media as well. So there's censorship everywhere, deplatforming everywhere. You know, there's a real crackdown happening now because of the war. So let's talk a little bit about this policy. Now, everybody's reaction, at least insofar as I've seen, is to say like, Jesus Christ, this is terrible. You shouldn't do that. My issue with it is a little bit different. The only issue here is that this isn't applied equally across the board. So in other words, if you're going to allow people to say death to the Russian invaders, you should also allow people to say like death to the Azov battalion or death to Ukrainian neo-Nazis and things of that nature. But they're not doing that. In fact, what I have here, I have another story here, which says Facebook is reversing its ban on posts praising Ukraine's far-right Azov battalion, report says. So now, I don't know the rules. If you praise the Russian invasion, like, are they going to pull down those comments? My guess is they might pull those down, but they'll leave up the post praising the Azov battalion. So the issue here is that there is no equal application. They're not actually creating a standard and then applying that standard. The issue is they're just doing carve-outs for Russia in particular. And so they say, like, yeah, you could call for violence against Russia, but if you can't call for violence against the Azov battalion or violence against, Ukrainian neo-Nazis, another good example here would be for the U.S., like when we invaded Iraq. Should you be allowed to say death to the American invaders or death to the American imperialists? I would argue yes. If you're in the Palestinian territories, are you allowed to say death to the Israeli occupiers? I would argue yes. The only thing that should really cross a line is direct threats of violence. And so, there has to be a certain degree of specificity or credibility to the claims. If you just broadly say death to X, it's still not a good thing to say, and you shouldn't say it. It's bad. But at the same time, it doesn't quite reach that level of ban-worthy, in my opinion. And so the issue here is not the policy. I think the policy is fine. The issue is that the policy is not equally applied. And so there's specific carve-outs. You're allowed to call for more violence against, quote, Russian invaders than you are against anybody else. And, you would understand a situation where, say, a Rohingya Muslim living in Myanmar says death to the Myanmar government or whatever, but my guess is, again, it's just specific carve-outs for Russia, and that shows you this is just part of that hysteria that we've talked about, which is now Russian cats are banned from cat shows. Now, Russian vodka and alcohol is banned in over 10 different states. There's a number of these stories that are just jarring. Another one is the Belarusian and Russian athletes in the Paralympics are banned. I mean, come on, the Paralympics, that's like the special needs handicapped Olympics, and like, what the hell did those people do? They didn't do anything wrong. Why are you blaming them for what Vladimir Putin does and for what the Russian government does? It doesn't make any sense at all. So this is just part of that mania and that hysteria. So that leads me to say, this is terrible. This is not a good thing. But again, I wouldn't have an issue with it if it was just like general, non-specific, broad calls for violence against, various things, as long as it's not civilians. That would be a fine policy. Again, in the U.S., we have, on paper, the most rigid, free speech protections in the world. And it's very hard to prove any sorts of violations of our free speech protections. One of the things would be direct threats of violence would violate it. But, stress on the term direct, it has to actually be direct. And these broad calls are not direct. But again, there is a problem here, and the problem is it's not a policy that's applied objectively and fairly. It's carving out specifics for just Russia. And that also shows you, of course, that a lot of these U.S.-based companies are sort of just in bed with the American government, and whatever the American government wants them to do, they do, and this is a great example of it right here. Hey, y'all, do me a favor and like and subscribe. It helps out big time in the algorithm. Click the bell as well for notifications when videos drop, and watch that video on screen right now. You know you want to.